3 words. That's all it took to start a collapse no one inside Team USA saw coming. Not a bad game. Not a missed shot. Not even a controversial loss. Just 3 words spoken quietly, behind closed doors, that would eventually cost millions, destroy reputations, and expose a decision that had nothing to do with basketball. Because when Caitlin Clark was left off Team USA, the world was told it was about experience, about chemistry, about timing. But that explanation was never the truth. And what finally leaked out of that locker room didn't just change how fans saw the decision. It changed how executives, sponsors, and even players inside the system saw it too. This wasn't a mistake. It was fear. And once that fear was exposed, everything started to unravel. When Team USA officially announced its roster, the response was instant. Caitlin Clark wasn't on it. And within minutes, the explanation was already circulating everywhere. She's young. She'll have her time. International basketball is different. The veterans earned it. The language was calm, measured, reassuring. It was designed that way. Because institutions don't panic publicly. They control the narrative. And in the beginning, they did exactly that. Sports networks debated the decision like it was a complicated chess move. Commentators nodded along, reminding viewers that Olympic teams are about balance, not hype. Fans were told to trust the process. And for a moment, many did. Not because it made sense, but because people are conditioned to believe that organizations like Team USA know something the public doesn't. But the cracks showed almost immediately. Because this wasn't a borderline player. This wasn't someone fighting for the final spot. This was the most visible athlete in women's basketball. The player breaking scoring records that stood for decades. The player pulling millions of casual viewers into a sport they had never watched before. The player whose games weren't just games, they were events. And suddenly, the story was that she wasn't ready. That contradiction bothered people. Quietly at first. Fans started comparing numbers. Former players started asking careful questions. Media personalities hesitated, then slowly pushed back. Because readiness didn't line up with reality. And deep down, people could feel it. This decision wasn't about performance. It wasn't about development. And it definitely wasn't about basketball fit. It was about something no one wanted to say out loud. And while the public was still debating hypotheticals, something had already happened behind closed doors that made the official story impossible to sustain. Because someone inside the program knew the truth. And they couldn't carry it anymore. The leak didn't arrive as a dramatic reveal. There was no press conference. No anonymous Twitter thread. No sudden viral clip. It came quietly. A conversation. A confirmation. A realization that what people suspected was actually worse than they imagined. According to the source, this wasn't a heated argument or a chaotic meeting. It was calm. Almost too calm. Caitlin Clark's name came up, and the room didn't react the way you'd expect when discussing a generational talent. There was no excitement. No urgency. No debate about how to use her. Instead, the tone shifted. The discussion stopped being about basketball and started being about control. What happens if she becomes the center of attention? What happens if the cameras follow her instead of us? What happens if the team becomes her story instead of ours? Those questions weren't asked directly. They didn't need to be. The source described a feeling in the room, a tension that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with fear. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of losing authority. Fear of being overshadowed on the biggest stage in the world. And that's when the language changed. Not openly hostile. Not aggressive. Dismissive. Caitlin Clark wasn't discussed like a player fighting for a role. She was framed like a complication. A distraction. Something that needed to be managed rather than embraced. And once that framing took hold, the decision was already made. Not because she couldn't help the team, but because her presence threatened the balance of power inside it. When the conversation ended, the room reportedly went quiet. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone understood the implication. This wasn't about merit. It was about fear of what she represented. And for weeks, that truth stayed buried. Until the person who heard it all realized something they couldn't escape. If this ever came out, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be devastating. And once that realization set in, silence was no longer an option. Once Caitlin Clark was no longer being discussed as a basketball decision, everything else followed naturally. According to the source, the language used inside that room mattered more than people realize. Because words don't just describe decisions. They justify them. Instead of breaking down her shooting, her passing, or how she would fit into rotations, the conversation shifted into something far more abstract. Narratives. Caitlin Clark wasn't framed as a competitor. She wasn't framed as a teammate. She wasn't even framed as a risk. She was framed as a problem. Not because of what she did wrong, but because of what she represented. Attention. Spotlight. Influence. The source described how her name was repeatedly paired with phrases that had nothing to do with basketball. Words tied to optics. Distraction. Media pressure. As if her popularity itself was something dangerous. And that framing allowed people in power to do something subtle but effective. They stopped talking about her game entirely. Once that happened, the decision no longer needed to be defended with stats or tape. It could be defended with ideology. Team culture. Focus. Discipline. All words that sound responsible on the surface, but mean whatever the speaker wants them to mean behind closed doors. And that's when the line was crossed. Because when leadership stops evaluating talent and starts evaluating threat, fairness disappears completely. Caitlin Clark wasn't being compared to other players anymore. She was being compared to a version of the future that scared them. And that fear reshaped everything. But the most unsettling part wasn't what was said. It was how casually it was said. No outrage. No argument. No one pushing back hard enough to stop it. Which brings us to the moment that confirmed this wasn't just talk. Every toxic culture has a moment where silence becomes permission. According to the source, that moment came not during a meeting, but during what was supposed to be an informal team gathering. No cameras. No media. No outsiders. Just people who believed they were protected. That's when the jersey appeared. A Team USA jersey with Caitlin Clark's name on it. Not as an announcement. Not as a symbol of inclusion. As a prop. The source described how the jersey was held up briefly, almost jokingly, before being tossed aside. What mattered wasn't the action itself, but the reaction. Some laughed. Some looked away. Some froze. And some said nothing. That silence mattered more than the laughter ever could. Because when leadership doesn't intervene, behavior becomes normalized. No one stopped it. No one called it out. No one shut it down. And the coach, according to the source, was aware of what happened. She didn't correct it. She didn't address it. She didn't set a boundary. Which sent a message far louder than words ever could. Caitlin Clark wasn't just excluded. She was being mocked. And once that line was crossed, the culture hardened. This wasn't accidental anymore. It wasn't careless humor. It wasn't misinterpretation. It was permission. And cultures like that don't stay contained for long. Because once people feel protected from consequences, behavior escalates. And soon, the damage wasn't just emotional. It was financial. The most dangerous part of this situation wasn't the backlash. It was the silence. Because silence from fans doesn't mean acceptance. It means indifference. And indifference is fatal to entertainment. Inside Team USA's internal analytics reports, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Engagement curves that normally spiked around roster announcements flattened. Social traction plateaued instead of accelerating. The emotional temperature just dropped. That scared people. Because hype is supposed to snowball. This year it stalled. Marketing teams ran comparisons against previous Olympic cycles. Same time frame. Same promotional spend. Same media exposure. Different result. The difference wasn't subtle. Caitlin Clark wasn't on the roster. And the audience noticed by not showing up. What executives underestimated was how much of the modern women's basketball audience was new. These weren't legacy fans loyal to institutions. These were casual viewers pulled in by storylines, personalities, and moments. And Caitlin Clark had become the biggest storyline of all. She wasn't just driving viewership. She was shaping who even cared. When she was removed, that audience didn't migrate to another player. They didn't transfer loyalty to the jersey. They disengaged completely. That realization hit hard. Because once casual fans leave, they don't complain. They disappear. And disappearing audiences don't come back easily. Merchandising partners began adjusting forecasts quietly. Shelf space was reduced. Digital storefront placement was downgraded. No press releases, no drama, just subtle shifts that signaled declining confidence. And then came the most uncomfortable comparison of all. Team USA content performance versus Caitlin Clark content. Side by side, the gap was brutal. Her highlights traveled faster. Her clips drew stronger engagement. Her name alone outperformed entire campaigns. That's when executives stopped arguing philosophy and started asking survival questions. What happens if this trend continues? What happens if we've misread the market completely? What happens if we've alienated the future audience? Those questions reached sponsors quickly. Not because sponsors were angry, because they were confused. They had invested expecting momentum. Instead, they were seeing stagnation. And stagnation is unacceptable in a growth phase. Private calls happened. Emails were exchanged. Budgets were reviewed. No ultimatums were issued. They didn't need to be. Everyone understood the implication. If this didn't change, money would move elsewhere. And once money shifts, power follows. That's when panic quietly set in. Panic rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks strategic. When leadership realized the numbers weren't rebounding, the goals shifted from defending the decision to protecting credibility. And credibility, in moments like this, is preserved by redirecting doubt. So the messaging changed. Not officially, not publicly, but consistently. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about whether Caitlin Clark should have been selected. It was about whether she was ready emotionally. Language softened but sharpened at the same time. She's still learning. She's adjusting to pressure. She's incredibly talented, but did a lot of work. Because it planted a question without making an accusation. And questions linger longer than statements. Media outlets picked it up cautiously. No one wanted to accuse the organization directly. But they also didn't want to look naive. So they hedged. Segments became debates instead of critiques. Panels framed uncertainty as balance. Speculation masqueraded as analysis. And the more it circulated, the more it felt real. This is how perception is shaped without evidence. For a brief window, the strategy slowed the bleeding. Public outrage softened. Discussion fragmented. Focus drifted. But there was a flaw. Smear campaigns require discipline. And someone broke it. One source, comfortable with anonymity, spoke too clearly. They didn't just hint. They explained. They contextualized. They revealed motivation. That was the mistake. Because once motivation is revealed, narrative collapses. Reporters began connecting dots, comparing phrasing, matching timelines, recognizing patterns. Independent whispers weren't independent at all. They were coordinated. That revelation reframed everything overnight. Suddenly, Caitlin Clark wasn't the subject of controversy. She was the victim of it. And the people who tried to subtly control perception were now being scrutinized themselves. Why did they need this narrative? What were they protecting? What were they afraid of? Those questions were far more damaging than the original backlash. Because institutions can survive being wrong. They struggle to survive being exposed as manipulative. Once that line was crossed, the smear strategy didn't just fail. It detonated. Trust evaporated. Sympathy shifted. Momentum flipped. And Caitlin Clark didn't need to say a word. Her silence became the loudest statement of all. The moment the documentation surfaced, the story stopped being controllable. This wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't fan outrage. This wasn't social media noise. This was proof. And proof changes behavior. Because once internal communications began circulating among journalists and insiders, people inside the league were forced to make a choice. Stay silent. Or step forward. For weeks, silence had been the safer option. Silence protects careers. Silence avoids backlash. Silence keeps doors open. But silence also becomes unbearable when the truth is too obvious to ignore. The first crack didn't come from a rookie or a fringe player. It came from someone established. Someone respected. Someone with nothing left to prove. A veteran. Not through a polished statement. Not through an agent. Not through a press release. She went live. No script. No filters. Just frustration. She didn't name names. She didn't dramatize it. She simply said what many had been thinking. What's happening to Caitlin Clark is wrong. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from watching the same patterns repeat for years and finally realizing this time was different. She talked about politics, about jealousy, about fear of change. And when she said she'd never seen anything like this before, people listened. Because this wasn't coming from the outside anymore. It was coming from within. That single moment opened the floodgates. Anonymous players started speaking to reporters. Former stars began sharing opinions they'd previously kept private. Legends weighed in carefully at first, then more forcefully. And a theme emerged quickly. This wasn't about one player being overlooked. It was about an old system panicking as a new era arrived. Caitlin Clark represented growth. Growth threatens control. And control, once threatened, rarely goes quietly. But the most damaging commentary came from someone who had already lived through multiple generations of the sport. A Hall of Famer. Someone whose legacy was secure enough to speak freely. She didn't sugarcoat it. She called it insecurity dressed up as professionalism. She said the league was punishing success instead of rewarding it. And she warned that if this mindset continued, it wouldn't just hurt Caitlin Clark. It would stunt the future of women's basketball itself. That statement reframed everything. Because now the controversy wasn't isolated. It was systemic. And once that realization set in, the conflict inside the league became impossible to contain. Behind the scenes, leadership had already scheduled what many described as an emergency meeting. No cameras. No press. No leaks allowed. At least, that was the plan. USA basketball executives, WNBA leadership, Olympic Committee representatives, and one coaching staff that suddenly realized the ground beneath them was shifting. The agenda was simple. What do we do now? The tension in the room was immediate. Not awkward. Not polite. Hostile. Years of suppressed frustration came out all at once. Accusations flew. Voices rose. People stopped pretending this was just about basketball philosophy. Because the numbers were now undeniable. Ratings were down. Merchandise projections missed targets. Sponsors were delaying renewals. And every uncomfortable spreadsheet pointed to the same conclusion. The absence of Caitlin Clark had cost them. Badly. One executive reportedly slammed their hand on the table and asked a question no one wanted to answer. Do you have any idea how much money this decision has cost us? The coach responded the only way she could, by repeating the same talking points. Experience, physicality, chemistry. But the room wasn't buying it anymore. Someone cut her off. We've seen the leaks. Another voice followed. We know this wasn't about basketball. That's when the conversation shifted from evaluation to accountability. And for the first time, the coach wasn't in control of the room. A proposal was made. Public acknowledgement. Structural changes. A clear path toward inclusion going forward. It wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as survival. But when the question was directed at the coach directly, when she was asked whether she would support Caitlin Clark's inclusion in the future, the response stunned everyone present. She refused. Not diplomatically. Not cautiously. Completely. The words didn't just reject the proposal. They rejected reality. That was the moment the room realized there was no compromise left. And once that line was crossed, the outcome was inevitable. While executives argued in boardrooms and insiders leaked selectively to protect themselves, Caitlin Clark was doing something that caught everyone off guard. She disengaged from the noise. No public rebuttals. No emotional defenses. No attempts to set the record straight. That silence confused people. Because in modern sports culture, silence is usually interpreted as weakness, as avoidance, as someone losing control of the narrative. But this silence was different. It wasn't hesitation. It was confidence. Caitlin Clark understood something most institutions forget. You don't win power struggles by talking. You win them by making yourself indispensable. And that's exactly what she did. Every game she played after the controversy carried extra weight. Not because she said anything, but because everyone watching understood the subtext. This is what you passed on. Arenas filled earlier. Crowds stayed louder longer. Broadcasts lingered on her reactions, her body language, her calm. She wasn't playing angry. She was playing inevitable. And inevitability is terrifying to institutions built on control. Because once something feels inevitable, resistance becomes pointless. Numbers confirmed it quickly. Viewership didn't just rise. It concentrated. Games featuring Caitlin Clark didn't merely outperform league averages, they redefined them. Demographics shifted. Younger viewers tuned in. First-time fans stuck around. This wasn't hype anymore. It was habit. And habits are what advertisers care about most. Brands noticed immediately. At first, quietly. Then aggressively. What had once been cautious endorsement conversations turned urgent. Companies weren't asking whether Caitlin Clark was worth investing in anymore. They were asking how fast they could secure her. Internal bidding wars broke out. Timelines shortened. Deals accelerated. Because brands saw the same thing fans did. She wasn't riding a moment. She was becoming infrastructure. And here's the part Team USA didn't anticipate. Every brand that leaned into Caitlin Clark wasn't just investing in her. They were hedging against the institution that rejected her. Budgets shifted. Campaigns pivoted. Messaging subtly realigned. The ecosystem was recentering around the player, not the program. That's when the realization hit leadership hardest. They didn't just lose control of one roster decision. They lost control of the narrative economy. Because now, Caitlin Clark didn't need Team USA to validate her relevance. Team USA needed Caitlin Clark to stabilize theirs. And that reversal happened without a single press conference, without a single demand, without a single threat. It happened organically, which made it impossible to fight. The most unsettling part for decision-makers wasn't the public reaction. It was the private one. Emails internally shifted tone. Language became cautious. Certainty evaporated. The same people who once spoke confidently about process and long-term vision began using conditional phrasing. If she's open to it, if the timing aligns, if we can repair the relationship. Those words mattered, because they revealed the truth. Power had changed hands, and Caitlin Clark never asked for it. She simply became too valuable to ignore. Meanwhile, fans noticed the shift too. The conversation online changed. Sympathy turned into admiration. Outrage turned into resolve. People weren't just defending her anymore. They were rooting for her independence. Because there's something deeply compelling about watching someone outgrow the very system that tried to limit them. And by the time leadership realized what had happened, the window to quietly fix things was gone. The story wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about leverage. And Caitlin Clark had all of it. By the time the decision was made, it didn't feel dramatic. That was the most telling part. There were no fiery confrontations left. No speeches. No final arguments. Just exhaustion. Inside leadership circles, the tone had shifted from defense to damage control. The question was no longer who was right. It was how much worse this could get if it continued. And the answer was clear. Very. Internal projections showed the trend line wasn't correcting. Interest wasn't rebounding. The audience that had drifted away wasn't returning just because the controversy cooled. Because controversies fade. Structural mistakes don't. Every new article reopened the wound. Every interview reignited questions. Every sponsor meeting carried the same uncomfortable pause. And in those pauses, leadership realized something they hadn't before. This wasn't a temporary storm. It was a reputational shift. The organization that once represented opportunity, unity, and excellence was now being associated with insecurity and resistance to change. That association mattered. Because brands don't just attach themselves to success. They attach themselves to direction. And right now, the direction looked backward. That's when contingency plans quietly moved from hypothetical to active. Succession discussions began. Advisors were consulted. Legal language was reviewed. Not because anyone wanted chaos, but because stability now required sacrifice. And in institutions like this, sacrifice almost always flows downward. The announcement itself was carefully engineered. Not to explain, not to admit, but to conclude. Stepping down. Mutual decision. New chapter. Words chosen not for honesty, but for insulation. Because public accountability would have required admitting something far more dangerous than a bad roster decision. It would have required admitting fear. So the exit was quiet. No farewell tour. No extended interviews. No opportunity to reframe the narrative. Just absence. And absence, in this case, spoke louder than anything else could have. But what followed mattered more than the exit itself. Because exits can be symbolic. Structural change is not. Within days, internal documents began circulating outlining adjustments to the selection process. New language appeared. Different priorities were emphasized. Growth, visibility, global impact. The very concepts that had once been treated as liabilities were now presented as assets. That wasn't coincidence. That was correction. The institution wasn't just moving on from a coach. It was retreating from a philosophy that had failed in public. And still, even then, there was hesitation. Because one question lingered over every meeting, every press interaction, every internal memo. What if she says no? What if Caitlin Clark doesn't want reconciliation? What if she doesn't need closure? That possibility unsettled leadership more than the backlash ever did. Because for the first time, inclusion wasn't something they could grant. It was something they had to request. When reporters finally asked whether Caitlin Clark would be welcomed in the future, the answer came quickly. Too quickly. As if it had been rehearsed. Of course. She represents everything this program stands for. We would be honored. The words were polished. But the power behind them was gone. And Caitlin Clark's response revealed that instantly. Measured. Neutral. Uncommitted. No anger. No celebration. No urgency. Just distance. And distance, when paired with leverage, is devastating. Because it signals independence. The institution that once decided her future was now waiting on hers. That reversal didn't come from protest. It didn't come from pressure. It didn't come from confrontation. It came from relevance shifting. From attention moving. From audiences choosing differently. And that's what Team USA truly lost. Not control of a roster. Control of the story. Because once the story no longer belongs to the institution, no amount of restructuring can fully restore the old balance. The system survived, but it emerged smaller, more cautious, less certain. And Caitlin Clark? She emerged untouched by the collapse. Not because she avoided it, but because she outgrew it. By now, it was clear this situation had outgrown Caitlin Clark entirely. What she represented had become more important than who she was. Because when people inside the league began dissecting what actually went wrong, they kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. This wasn't a misjudgment of talent. It wasn't a breakdown in evaluation. It wasn't even personal. It was structural. Women's basketball, like most long-standing institutions, had grown comfortable operating within predictable limits. Growth was welcome, as long as it was gradual, controlled, familiar. Stars could rise, but not too fast. Attention could grow, but not unevenly. Change could happen, but only with permission. Caitlin Clark shattered that rhythm. She didn't arrive as a prospect to be shaped by the system. She arrived as a force that reshaped the system around her. And systems don't resist individuals. They resist loss of control. For years, influence in women's basketball flowed in a very specific direction. From governing bodies to teams. From teams to players. From players to fans. Caitlin reversed that current. Fans didn't discover her through the institution. The institution was suddenly chasing her audience. That inversion terrified people who had built careers on being gatekeepers. Because gatekeeping only works when the gate matters. And Caitlin Clark made it irrelevant. This wasn't the first time sports had seen a moment like this. It happens whenever a generational figure breaks through faster than the infrastructure designed to contain them. The difference this time was timing. Social media accelerated everything. Data exposed everything. Fans had options. There was no buffer period to adjust quietly. The system had to react in real time. And reaction is where fear reveals itself. Instead of asking how to evolve, leadership asked how to preserve authority. Instead of adapting to a new model of stardom, they tried to reinforce the old one. That choice mattered. Because once an institution chooses preservation over progress, it signals something deeper. It signals insecurity. And insecurity, when paired with power, creates resistance instead of leadership. This is why Caitlin Clark became a lightning rod. Not because she demanded anything, but because she exposed how fragile the structure actually was. The league wasn't rejecting her. It was defending itself. And in doing so, it revealed something fans had never fully seen before. That women's basketball didn't just struggle against external limitations. It struggled internally with its own success. That realization changed the conversation permanently. Because once fans understand that growth is being slowed intentionally, trust fractures. And fractured trust doesn't heal easily. This moment forced everyone to confront a hard truth. If the system couldn't handle Caitlin Clark, someone who brought attention, revenue, and visibility, what would it do to the next one? And the one after that? That question still hasn't been answered. It's language. Because language doesn't just describe reality. It defines what is acceptable within it. And in this situation, the word that did the most damage wasn't fear, or jealousy, or even control. It was professionalism. On the surface, professionalism sounds harmless, responsible, necessary, even noble. But inside the walls of power, it often means something else entirely. It means compliance. Caitlin Clark didn't violate any rules. She didn't embarrass the league. She didn't disrespect anyone publicly. But she did something far more threatening. She didn't need permission. And that independence was reframed as a flaw. When insiders talked about professionalism, What they were really talking about was predictability, about knowing where someone fits in the hierarchy, about being able to manage outcomes. Caitlin Clark disrupted that. She didn't rise slowly enough to be absorbed. She didn't wait long enough to be molded. She didn't ask often enough to be controlled. So professionalism became the shield. You're not being excluded. You're just not ready. You're not being punished. You're just being developed. You're not being targeted. You're just being held to a standard. Standards that shifted depending on who they were applied to. Veteran players could have flaws and still be experienced. Rising stars without permission were suddenly raw. The language was elastic. And that elasticity allowed leadership to justify decisions without ever confronting their real motivation. Because saying, "We're uncomfortable with how fast this is changing" sounds weak. Saying, "This is about professionalism" sounds authoritative. That distinction matters. Because fans don't argue with professionalism. They trust it. They assume it's rooted in wisdom and long-term thinking. That's why this framing worked at first. It didn't provoke outrage. It provoked hesitation. And hesitation buys time. But here's what leadership underestimated. Professionalism only works as a weapon when audiences believe it's being applied fairly. The moment it looks selective, it collapses. And the moment people began comparing how Caitlin Clark was discussed versus how others were protected, the cracks became obvious. Why was visibility treated as arrogance? Why was confidence treated as attitude? Why was dominance treated as disruption? Those questions didn't come from analysts. They came from fans. And fans are dangerous to systems built on assumed authority. Because fans don't need to be right. They just need to be unconvinced. Once that happened, professionalism stopped sounding like guidance. It started sounding like control. And control, when exposed, breeds resistance. This is why the backlash deepened instead of fading. Not because people felt bad for Caitlin Clark, but because they recognized a familiar tactic. The same one used anytime someone moves too fast, shines too brightly, or refuses to fit neatly into a structure designed decades earlier. Professionalism wasn't protecting the game. It was protecting the gate. And once that truth became visible, the entire defense strategy unraveled. Because you can't weaponize language forever. Eventually, reality catches up. And when it does, words lose their power. While executives debated messaging and coaches defended philosophy, fans were doing something much simpler. They were voting. With clicks. With tickets. With attention. Every game Caitlin Clark played drew energy. Every game she didn't, lost it. This wasn't complicated. Casual fans didn't care about internal politics. They cared about excitement. About moments. About players who made them feel something. And Caitlin Clark did that consistently. Parents brought kids to games just to watch her warm up. Young players mimicked her shot in driveways across the country. People who had never followed women's basketball suddenly had favorite teams. That momentum didn't disappear when Team USA left her off the roster. It redirected, away from the institution, toward the individual. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Because audiences don't like being told what they should care about. They decide for themselves. Internally, leadership tried to regain control the only way they knew how. Through structure. Committees were formed. Processes were reviewed. Statements were drafted. But structure can't compete with authenticity. And Caitlin Clark's appeal wasn't manufactured. It wasn't engineered by marketing teams. It wasn't handed to her by networks. It was earned. Every deep three. Every clutch moment. Every game where she carried pressure without flinching. The more the system tried to reassert control, the more obvious it became that control was already gone. Because now, even the idea of excluding her carried consequences. Not just backlash. Financial risk. And institutions can survive criticism. They struggle to survive irrelevance. As the dust settled, one question kept resurfacing in executive conversations. What happens if she says no? What happens if Caitlin Clark decides she doesn't need Team USA at all? That question lingered longer than anyone expected. Because for decades, representing Team USA was the pinnacle. The ultimate validation. The highest honor. But honor only matters when both sides need it equally. And for the first time, that balance had shifted. Caitlin Clark didn't need validation. She had leverage. And leverage changes everything. It forces institutions to adapt or fade. And the people who once believed they were untouchable were now facing a reality they never prepared for. They no longer controlled the future. They were reacting to it. The story doesn't end with a resignation or a policy change. It ends with a question that still hasn't been answered. Who really lost here? The coach? The organization? Or the system that mistook control for stability? Because Caitlin Clark didn't just survive this moment. She redefined it. And what happens next may matter even more than everything that came before. What happened with Caitlin Clark didn't just expose a mistake. It created a new reality. Because once a system shows its fear, everyone watching learns something important. They learn where the boundaries are. They learn what happens when someone moves too fast, too loudly, too successfully. And they learn how power reacts when it feels threatened. Future players were watching closely. Not just stars. Not just prospects. Everyone. Young players saw that success alone isn't always enough. That dominance can create resistance instead of support. That being undeniable doesn't always mean being embraced. But they also saw something else. They saw that power doesn't always win. Because Caitlin Clark didn't retreat. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for being visible. She kept going. And that mattered. Because every generation needs a moment where the rules stop being assumed and start being questioned. This was that moment. For decades, the path was clear. Earn respect quietly. Wait your turn. Don't challenge hierarchy. But Caitlin Clark didn't follow that script. Not because she refused to, but because the moment didn't allow it. Her impact was immediate, unavoidable, too big to ignore. And instead of adjusting to that reality, the system tried to slow it down. That's the mistake. Because modern audiences don't connect to institutions the way they used to. They connect to people, to stories, to authenticity. And when a system appears to punish the very thing driving growth, fans notice. They question it. They resist it. They disengage, which forces change whether leadership wants it or not. This situation accelerated something that was already coming. A shift in who holds leverage. And once leverage moves toward the individual, the old playbook stops working. What made this entire saga more powerful wasn't anything Caitlin Clark said publicly. It was what she didn't say. No emotional interviews. No public accusations. No attempts to control the narrative. She let time do the work. Every sold-out game became a response. Every ratings spike became a counterargument. Every endorsement deal became validation. In an era where outrage is loud and constant, her restraint stood out. It wasn't passive. It was strategic. Because the loudest response to exclusion is success that can't be denied. And by the time leadership adjusted, the dynamic had already flipped. They weren't evaluating her anymore. They were reacting to her. Organizations survive by reading moments correctly. This one didn't. They assumed fans would follow tradition. They assumed loyalty would outweigh excitement. They assumed the institution was the draw. They were wrong. Because attention isn't inherited anymore. It's earned. And Caitlin Clark earned it in a way that couldn't be replicated or replaced. That miscalculation didn't just cost money. It cost trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. Especially when audiences feel manipulated instead of respected. This was a lesson learned publicly. Painfully. Now, everything looks different. Roster decisions are scrutinized. Language is analyzed. Intent is questioned. Not because fans are cynical, but because they're aware. And awareness is dangerous to systems built on quiet compliance. The biggest question moving forward isn't whether Caitlin Clark will represent Team USA. It's whether Team USA can adapt to a future where players like her don't need permission to matter. Because once that threshold is crossed, the balance of power never fully resets. It only moves forward. This story isn't just about one decision, one coach, or one player. It's about what happens when growth scares the people in charge. It's about how fear makes institutions protect themselves instead of the game. And it's about how one player changed the conversation without ever raising her voice. If you want more stories like this, stories that go deeper than headlines and expose what's really happening behind the scenes in basketball, make sure you're subscribed. Because the game isn't just played on the court anymore. And the most important moments rarely happen in public.